you know,
Mhm.
on the scope and power. He made those claims about himself. People believed he did those things. The tomb's found empty. There's a missing body. Enemies admit the tomb's empty. Disciples believe they saw post-mortem appearances. Paul goes from a skeptic to a fervent believer, randomly seeming out of nowhere. The apostles preached Jesus was alive in the same very city that he had been killed. The New Testament church actually starts, and disciples are willing to be persecuted and die for their eyewitness. These are not disputed facts. Paul's conversion is not disputed, but the resurrection it gives the why.
Mm.
It gives the why in a very effective way.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's episode. I have joining me today Josh Gehly from the Church of Jesus Christ. Josh, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this episode. It was recommended to me by my friend and your friend Steve Pinecker, and you're the author of this book. It is Witnessing Miracles: Historical Evidence for the Resurrection and the Book of Mormon, and it's a great read. I've read it in about 2 or 3 days, and it was really fascinating that you go over the both the facts and the evidence and the interpretations that you can draw for both the resurrection and then applying that also to the Book of Mormon and the testimony of the witnesses of the gold plates. And it's a great read. I would recommend it not just to believing Latter-day Saints. I'd also recommend it to Christians as well, so they could see, some of these arguments and evidence you're making for the resurrection. You can make a stronger case for the Book of Mormon. And even atheists who don't believe in God, I think it's quite a strong book for the evidence and case for the resurrection and the Book of Mormon, which you might not have considered before. But before we get into that, we're going to dive in deeply into the arguments and evidence for the resurrection and the Book of Mormon. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background. You're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. You're not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Did you convert? Were you raised in that church? And maybe tell us a little about the background of that church as well and how it relates to the Restoration movement.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm Josh Gehly. Excuse me. I'm Josh Gehly. I'm an ordained evangelist in the Church of Jesus Christ. And our church follows the lineage, like to trace our way back to the angel that flew through the midst of heaven, back to April 6th, 1830. Okay, and May 15th, 1829. As we work our way through the historical record, we follow the church as an organization through Sidney Rigdon. He was the only surviving member of the first presidency at
Mm,
the time of Joseph Smith's death. And so he was living in Pennsylvania. He was from Pennsylvania, and he was an organizer and leader in Kirtland early on when the church first started to migrate west. And he was really a pillar in the church for a decade. And when Joseph Smith was running for had a presidential ticket, first they tried to get a secular candidate from, I think, Tennessee. That was no bueno. That wasn't going to go. The natural leader to run as vice president was Sidney Rigdon. And so, we honor Sidney Rigdon for the position that he held. In our church, the first presidency doesn't dissolve at the death of a church president. We
mm.
believe that those positions are maintained. And, when a president dies, a vice president in any organization naturally, takes the lead. So historically, we follow Sidney Rigdon. He eventually goes back to Pennsylvania, starts a small group, tries to build Zion, right? Every time he was somewhere, they were trying to build the kingdom. And that organization ultimately went defunct. It ultimately dissolved. But out of the ashes of that ultimate failure were a few faithful followers, one of whom was William Bickerton. William Bickerton was holding true to the Bible and Book of Mormon. He was an Englishman. He had immigrated basically around the time, a little bit after Joseph Smith's death. So he was never part of the early church, but he was a firm believer in the Bible and Book of Mormon. He had been ordained in the church at that time, and he started organizing a small congregation of saints. I think initially there was about 9 people.
Oh, wow.
And from that small group, eventually
Very much like the
is
beginnings of the church, April 6th, 1830.
100%, 100%. And we have always been a church that is, first, we're small, but we're spread out around the world. We're in Today, the Church of Jesus Christ is in about 26, 27 countries around the world. Our worldwide membership is about 30,000. So we're the second largest church that actually believes the Book of Mormon is historical, that it has arisen from the Restoration, right? So we're the third largest organization that's come from the Restoration, but we're the second largest that passionately pursue and consider the Book of Mormon to be both a religious and a historical document. So we love the Book of Mormon. We are a Bible and Book of Mormon thumping church. Those are the only parts of canon for us is Bible and Book of Mormon. I was raised in the church, so I'm sixth generation. Actually, the president of the church after William Bickerton would be my great 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 grandfather, William Cadman, and they were friends and contemporaries.
That's cool. And your church is also, I think, given the nickname Bickertonites. I think that's where I first heard of it, and I actually hadn't made the link until preparing for this interview that that's the same as the Church of Jesus Christ. Would you say that's similar to our church, being called Mormons, but the official name being the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Is it similar to that? Do you like being called Bickertonites, or do you prefer to be called by, the official name?
Well, I mean, we all read Third Nephi 27. We all read that Jesus Christ said, "If you're built upon my gospel, we would bear His name."
Right.
And so, do we like being called other names? Of course not. Of course not. Do I understand the historical implications and the reasons why people do? Absolutely, I do. But for us, the church, we're the Church of Jesus Christ. We bear His name, and we really don't want to be called by any other. We respect our leadership of the past, but that's not who we're following. We're not following Sidney Rigdon. We're not following William Bickerton. We're following Christ, and we believe they were too.
Very cool. And it's great to and it's good to open your mind that there are these different branches of the Restoration that believe in Joseph Smith and believe in the Book of Mormon. And I know for myself, obviously I'd heard of the RLDS Church growing up, but I think the person that really has brought to light how many different branches there are of the Restoration is Stephen Pineker's show, and I think it's really cool as well. And although there's maybe some differences in terms of the succession, we can be united in our belief in the Restoration and the Book of Mormon and the prophetic calling of Joseph Smith. So what I want to talk about next is what motivated you to write this book on the resurrection and the evidence for the Book of Mormon.
Sure. So there were two parts to this, really. The first part was I was asked to speak at a Book of Mormon in Zion conference. So I had attended a few of those before. That's put on by a few of the evangelists, or a few of the 70, excuse me, for the Joint Conference of Restoration Branches, so the JCRB, and multiple different groups. Usually there's a few BYU professors, so there's Latter-day Saint representation. JCRB have some representation as well. And I've seen the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, or the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message, the Assured Way. So a lot of different branches of the Restoration Movement come together for that conference, celebrating what we have in common, our love and belief for the Book of Mormon. So I had been asked to speak. And this was around the time that Jerry Grover had published his book on the geology and the Book of Mormon. And I was
It's a good book.
fascinated by that. Yeah, it's a great book. For those that know me, I'm a meso guy. So, I was deep diving into that, and I thought, well, I'd love to present something on this, but my hesitancy was, well, what am I going to do? Share this in front of a couple of BYU professors who already know Jerry and who already they know this material. What could I possibly bring to the table? So I was praying about that. And one night I was on YouTube and I was watching Gary Habermas from Liberty University present some of the leading historical evidence for the resurrection. And as he did, light bulbs were going off in my head, and I realized there was something there to be made. And I recognized two things. First, that this was good. Somebody surely had done this already. Somebody had surely taken the historical evidences from Christian apologetics and applied them to the golden plates in the Book of Mormon. Someone surely had to have done that. And the second part I recognized was I really am wearing rose-colored glasses. Okay, I'm a believer. I believe in the Book of Mormon. I've been blessed to see, miracles happen. I've witnessed the blind see. I've seen those that have been under the power of God that He's given in the restoration movement, and I've watched God over and over and over do amazing things. So I recognized I'm wearing rose-colored glasses. I need to
Mm,
take those off if I'm going to do this comparison. So I dove very deeply into both what would be the RLDS tradition and Latter-day Saint tradition to see if anybody had done this connection before. The very closest was Richard Lloyd Anderson. His book is obviously wonderful. I'd already read it before, but I
yeah.
reread it and I listened to everything he'd ever spoken that was recorded. I said, well, surely he did this. He got very close. He got very close. He would say things like, the only real comparison to this is kind of like the witnesses for Christ's resurrection, the disciples. And he would make that statement, but he wouldn't go the step. He never went the final step of actually outlaying the evidence for the resurrection, which I'm sure he had studied before, but he never laid it out in his work, and then actually do the comparison directly. He would just make either an offhand comment in a speech or in a presentation, or had one or two sentences in an article, but the full fleshed out version. I thought, okay, well, this is actually something that number one needs done, and it's right in front of me to do it. So I presented that year with the basics of this material. That was received really well. Eventually, it's turned into a book now, and I've been blessed to speak with anything from remnant groups with Denver Snuffer, conferences with them, and I've been blessed to speak in all different places where the restoration has gathered and present this material. And I'm really consider myself fortunate for that, and I think I did successfully take the rose-colored glasses off when I did the comparison. I didn't shy away from anything. I mean, I print the Day-Night Manifesto verbatim, word for word, in the book, so I'm not shying away from controversy and questions. Joseph Smith's Digging for Treasure is in the book. All those early question marks are there and addressed, and actually, maybe surprisingly, demonstrate a stronger understanding of what might be the historical grounds for the golden plates in the Book of Mormon.
Right. And that's one thing I've noticed in apologetics is like we often deal so much with everything related to Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon and church history. And I'd spent so many years of, since my faith crisis being much involved in those waters. And very little attention is given to the evidence or the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And really up until a year or two ago, I hadn't really even thought through sort of the arguments or the evidence, the case to be made in favor for the resurrection. And I think your book does a good job at taking a lot of the scholarship or the apologetics by people like William Lane Craig or N.T. Wright or others, but then also saying, look how this applies to the Book of Mormon. And if anything, the Book of Mormon has stronger evidence and documentation, eyewitness testimony in favor. So it's also a call to Christians that if you're going to say this is strong evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, we're not saying it's not, but then you need to take into account everything that we have here for the Book of Mormon.
Well, what was actually really interesting as I started studying out all the material on the Christian, the resurrection side of the fence, was many times some of those scholars said, well, any miracle should be evaluated based on these criteria. And they would lay out the criteria, and I would read that and go, thank you. This is a foundation for me to take and apply over to the Book of Mormon. So there's actually multiple times in both interviews and in written statements that somebody like a William Lane Craig, who I think is probably William Lane Craig, Michael Licona, you mentioned N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright really gets into more of the backdrop for the resurrection, but and that actually I think would be a secondary pursuit for somebody to dive into, especially with some of the most recent publications that he's done. But Michael Licona, William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, and others really present something that mirrors, okay, what are the foundational facts of this that both a believer and a non-believer would agree with? What are the source material, and really get into that to make what they call a minimal facts argument for the resurrection. And so what they're doing is they're stripping everything away and getting down to the least controversial points. And on the other side, I did the same thing. So, at the end of the day, a lot of the foundational points I would make would be agreed on by Dan Vogel and other scholars that
Yeah.
might disagree with my conclusion,
Hmm.
but the minimal facts might be the same. We both agree. I mean, the leading historical non-believer in the Book of Mormon, but is willing to take the background seriously, the leaders of that would all agree that there actually were a set of plates. They're not going to deny that. And that's the leading theory today, which is a very honest admission from someone like a Dan Vogel who doesn't believe in the miracle part. And then when you're looking at this comparison should be made because both these miracles are foundational for tremendous religious movements with millions of believers. Okay, so these miracles should be compared based on the same metrics and method because, they're both very foundational. And without them, there's no movement. C.S. Lewis made this quote in Mere Christianity. He said, Christianity is not, Christianity, if it's false, it's of no importance. No importance. If it's true, it's of infinite importance. But the one thing it can't be is like mediocrely important. I'm not quoting that perfectly, but it's like if it's false, it's meaningless. If it's true, it's everything. One thing it can't be is somewhere in the middle, somewhere lukewarm. And the same is true for the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is either of infinite importance because 2,500 people see the risen Christ, feel, take their hands and reach into his side and know and believe who he is. So the Book of Mormon offers an independent attestation of the risen Christ from a cross-continental appearance. That is either of infinite importance, or if it's false, it's meaningless. It has no background, no bearing on the resurrection whatsoever. So both opportunities lay themselves to be under the same category of either absolute, critical, infinite importance, or if false, meaningless, throw it away. And at the end
Right.
of it all, obviously, I'm still in my faith tradition, right? So I'm still there believing that once I took that off and did the examination, that it should be of infinite importance to pursue the historical evidence for both the resurrection and the Book of Mormon, and then overlay them on top of each other.
Right. And I'm sure there are people who, lose faith in God, Jesus, or the Bible and still find maybe some meaning in some of the teachings in the New Testament. But I tend to agree that really the truth of Christianity hinges upon, did Jesus die and then rise again? And it's similar to the truth claims of the Restoration. Did Joseph Smith really translate the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God? Did an angel come with ancient gold plates that other people testified to? And not everything's black and white, but it is kind of either it is true or it is not. And like you said, it's either of the most significant importance to the world, or if it's not, like, to be discarded. So let's dive into some of the facts. You outline this in a really clear and concise way in the book, and I can't recommend people enough to read your book, and especially chapter 8, the facts. That was, I think, a brilliant chapter. But for any people who aren't going to get the book, we'll maybe go over some of the highlights. So one of the first facts that people might maybe dispute, well, not scholars, but somebody might
Yep.
say, was there really a man named Jesus? Was he really a historical figure? Could have this not just been made up hundreds of years later? It's a mythical story. So talk about Jesus being a historical figure. Is this considered a fact?
Yeah, so this might actually surprise people, but even atheist and agnostic scholars that study the New Testament era of time, and they can be critical scholars like Bart Ehrman and others, Gerhard Ludemann. There's several that are out there that are considered leading New Testament scholars, but they are not believers. Okay, but they all have looked at the same data and said, well, if Jesus didn't die on the cross, then nothing can be known in ancient history. because they've evaluated the facts and they've looked at, and when I say the facts, what they've done is they've dove into the source material. First, they're willing to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as not as a biblical text, not as a scriptural, not as a canon, but as source material. Okay. Breaking down Mark historically as a source, Luke historically as a source, even, from the synoptic gospels, even looking at what might be common from the Q source, from the sources that might have been drawn from for Luke and for Matthew that might have been common and together.
Because
So
even if you reject the theological claims in these texts, there's still historical sources that need to be considered, and scholars take them seriously as historical documents.
yeah, and even like within Mark, the crucifixion account, Mark didn't actually witness that, but there are critical scholars that place the crucifixion account in Mark, that Mark's source would have been giving that within about 7 years after the activating event, which in the ancient world is super early. So there's pre-Pauline statements that come in some of Paul's writings, like Philippians chapter 2. There's a song that is there that's actually being, singing all about Christ and who he was and what he did. It's really a gospel song, but it's not from Paul. It predates Paul. Paul is using this early text, so the early Christian believers are singing this or sharing this poetry together because many of them are uneducated. Many of them now believe in Christ, but what's the core foundation for what we believe? Same thing with 1 Corinthians 15. There's multiple chapters,
That's
or First
considered like
Corinthians
an
8.
early apostolic Christian creed, isn't it? Dated to maybe a couple of years after Jesus' resurrection, that Paul seems to be quoting about who
Yes.
Jesus appeared to after his resurrection.
So within the New Testament, the whole story and outline is present and there. And so it definitely means that the earliest believers were sincerely teaching and sharing this information that Jesus died on the cross, that they believed that he rose, that he was seen of multiple witnesses. That's the core story that they're projecting out to their own Christian community, and it's foundational. Also, these scholars are looking at extra biblical accounts. You have something like Tacitus, Lucian, Tacitus being a Roman historian, Josephus, a Jewish man who's a non-believer, but is hired as a historian and working for the Romans. There's Greeks, and so you have about 5 or 6 early historians that are recording accounts about Jesus, which says everything that if you put those together, you can actually build an incredible gospel story from the non believing sources. They're even being critical about it, sometimes even mocking the Christians. But even as they're doing it, you can put together that there was a man named Jesus Christ, that he died. He received the maximal capital punishment of crucifixion by the hands of the Romans. Pontius Pilate is in some of those early sources, that he was part of this whole procedure, and that there's a claimed resurrection. All of those parts and pieces come from non-biblical, non-scriptural accounts within the earliest part of the historical record. So from an ancient source material, you actually do have the sources to consider the facts of the case. And many of them and I quote in the book, the atheist scholars that basically say the life and death and crucifixion of Jesus is a historical fact. It should not be disputed within the historical record. Now, they may make a different argument about the resurrection, that just three
Right.
days later, what happens. But in that moment, they're making some incredible admissions on what was actually going on in the day and time which Jesus was living. There's no leading scholar today on this era of time that I'm aware of that is not Muslim that would say that there weren't claims of resurrection and wouldn't say that he truly did die by crucifixion, because the Quran offers a different outlook, but obviously is
Mhm.
not tied to the same historical record. So,
Right. So that's quite strong. It's quite compelling that the historical consensus among historians and Bible scholars, you have both from the gospel accounts and the letters of Paul, but also non-Christian sources of contemporaries of the time, Josephus and others, that support that there was a historical figure called Jesus who preached and had a following that he was crucified on a cross. And maybe that will lead to the next historical fact is about the empty tomb. Um, Maybe talk about that. So we know in the gospel accounts that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. Is that accepted as a fact by Bible scholars and historians?
It really is. The burial by Joseph of Arimathea is sometimes disputed, but still the consensus leans towards it being accurate because the argument is from historians that are even non-Christian would be Joseph being a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, it would have been off color for him to take someone that had been crucified and allow him to be buried within his family, you know, sepulchers, the tombs. So
Yeah.
within that scenario, it makes it plausible to be true because it's actually a little countercultural. It shines forth as being very plausible that that might have been an accurate description because how would they have claimed that? How would the early Christians have made that claim unless it was accurate and true? Now, the actual evidence for the empty tomb is really interesting overall. Forget Joseph of Arimathea or the exact location for a moment. But the historical evidence for the empty tomb is extremely compelling that there was a tomb and it was where Jesus was buried and it was found empty. And the reason for that is they do this little acronym of JET, Jerusalem, enemies and unlikely testimonies, JET, and Jerusalem being the proximity. Within 40 days, the disciples are at the temple, on the streets, preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. And they're basically saying, if you don't believe us, go look for yourself. I mean, if were living in Jerusalem and you wanted to know if Jesus really left behind an empty tomb, you're within range, okay? You can take a long walk and go see for yourself. So the proximity of where the movement starts, the argument would be if they wanted to make that claim sound believable in their day and time, maybe they should have gone 3 towns away and
Right, go
started
to a
to
foreign
preach.
land.
Yeah, go somewhere else and start preaching. That's not where Christendom begins. Christendom begins right where the activating event happens. So if you want to know if Josephus buried Jesus and if there was an empty tomb, go talk to, or excuse me, Joseph
So
of
Arimathea.
Arimathea. Yeah. If he, go talk to Joseph and go see the tomb for yourself. This is something that you could do. So the proximity is really the founding principle of that one minimal fact component. Enemies in later on in the book of Matthew, it says that, and there's a little hint of some of Justice Martyr's writings. It's not as clear, but the clearest it comes from Matthew that the claim from the Sanhedrin was, well, the disciples must have stolen the body. Now, what's that admitting?
What's the implication to that?
The implication of that is that there really was an empty tomb. Okay, so
Because if the
even the
tomb wasn't
enemy's
empty,
testimony.
yeah, because if the tomb wasn't empty and they're out claiming Jesus rose again, we've seen him, and if the tomb wasn't empty, they could have been like, well, let's go check the tomb. His dead body's in here, his corpse is here. You're all wrong. And that would be like the end of Christianity. And like you said, if the early opponents of Christians, the Jews at the time, are saying that the disciples stole the body, that means they're acknowledging the tomb was empty.
Yeah, this is like Ben-Hur, right? Just find a body, produce a body, and it all ends. But there was no body to be found. That is an amazing admission from the enemies to the early church. And then unlikely testimonies. This is where when I'm presenting this, I tell the sisters, hold your tomatoes because I'm going to read some quotes that sound awful in today's context. Somebody like Josephus, and he writes and he says, well, don't let women testify in court because of the ignobility of their souls. And the Talmud says stuff like this, and early Jewish records say that it's better for a thief and a robber to give witness, somebody that is known as a male to be an enemy. or untrustworthy. They are more trustworthy in court of law than women, and they give their reasons. So, in the context of first century Palestine, in the context of the Levant in that day and time, women were not allowed to give testimony, or their testimonies were highly suspect. The
And it
fact
also
that the
adds,
Gospels, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it also adds context because you referenced in there that when the women first go to the disciples to testify of the empty tomb and the risen Lord, like one, you talk about how like Jews didn't like they obviously believe at at the end of days that everyone will be resurrected, but they didn't believe that someone would rise again. So they one didn't believe that Jesus was resurrected, but also because this came from the women, didn't they say something like that these are tall tales, and that's also the cultural context of the time of not believing the testimony of women.
Yeah, even buried in the accounts in John, they were considered as idle tales. They did not believe the women at first when they came back and made this grandiose. The Lord's risen. Like everybody that saw him die were like, okay, and just put it at arm's length. They, until Peter and John run to the tomb, right? So the fact that the earliest gospel accounts record the women in multiple independent attestations in the gospels, that it's the women that show up first, that they are the first witnesses. If you were writing to a first century Jew, or a Gentile for that matter, and say, this happened, we know it because the women told us so, that wouldn't have worked in that day and time, and yet that's exactly what's recorded in the Gospels. The women are the first witnesses. That is so countercultural to the day that the historical argument is, yet it must be an accurate, true thing. So the empty tomb is actually strongly attested within the historical record of something that today many even non-believing scholars, they might not have the final explanation of what actually happened, but they'll admit, yeah, there's been a that was empty, and that is on pretty solid historical grounds.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting
Remarkable.
what you said about the women because if this was being made up by the gospel writers, the authors of the gospel, and they wanted to try to make it sound as compelling and as persuasive, you wouldn't have the first eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection in the empty tomb being the women. And I think you also noted as well that in Corinthians when Paul is quoting the apostolic creed, shall we say, about the
He
resurrection,
leaves it out.
yeah, the women.
He
So
leaves the
even a
women
couple of
out.
years later, like, okay, let's not talk about the women's testimony, which is quite ironic. But I guess that makes sense of the cultural context of the day. But
Yeah,
it's in all
100%.
four of the gospel
100%.
accounts.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the last fact you talked about is that the disciples, the women who Jesus appeared to, the 12, and Paul also mentions that he knows 500 people who also claim to see Jesus. But at least the disciples, the apostles, sincerely believed that Jesus appeared to them, and then went on to spread Christianity, and were persecuted, and some of them killed. Like maybe talk about that as is this an established fact?
There's a nuance to this also that's really important as we look at this part of it, because martyrs exist, right? In our lifetimes, we saw people that were willing to fly a plane into a building tragically over what? Over a belief.
Right.
People die for beliefs all the time. That is not the historical argument that's being proffered here as an evidence for the resurrection. The argument that's being made is eyewitnesses were willing to die for what they said that they saw. And that's different than a belief that's based on firsthand direct knowledge. The persecution that happened to the early believers, their stance and their willingness to go through what they did, was not a stance of, well, Jesus told me this, so I'm willing to stand up and defend that for the rest of my days. No, no, no. The argument that's being made is the early believers were willing to suffer and to die, and they did suffer and they did die in many cases, in many different ways. And that's really not disputed too much. The historical record is it has this culmination that goes out that clearly they were suffering. I don't think that's disputed. Sometimes we don't have enough data to say specifically, well, was Thomas really speared through in India? Well, I don't know if there's enough on these historical grounds data to suggest that. But one thing that we would know is Thomas was willing to go out and willing to suffer and willing to die for the Christ that he had seen for himself. That's the argument that's being proffered, and that is a little nuance to the background, because sometimes people that are critical to this, they jump in and they go, "Oh, no, 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 people die for beliefs all the time." Yes, that's not the historical argument. The historical argument is being willing to suffer and die. The radical change that happened into their lives. You're going from fishermen to fishers of men. That radical change that's taking place can only happen because they saw Christ for themselves. And that is what created this massive transformation for these select few men and women that radically transformed. Ultimately, in the end, it's still transforming the world today.
Right, yeah, it's not just them being willing to be persecuted and die for beliefs, but they are eyewitnesses. It is knowledge, and if it's a fraud, it's not that they would be mistaken, but that they would know as well. And it's taken into account all those are the four facts. Jesus was a historical person. He was crucified by the Romans. He was buried in the tomb. Maybe some scholars might dispute Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, but he was buried in the tomb, and the tomb was empty as well, particularly because that's what opponents were saying. Early Jews were saying that the disciples must have stolen the body, and the disciples sincerely not just believed, but they were eyewitnesses that Jesus appeared to them. And I think most Bible scholars would agree that they believed that they had some sort of experiences with Jesus, even if they don't believe
Yeah.
in the resurrection.
I mean, even taking it a step back, just on some of the manuscript grounds, you have some of the writings of Clement and some of the early writings from the first generation of converts. And Clement himself, actually, he travels on missionary work with some of the disciples. So he's in the know. And he writes a letter to the Corinthians. And within that material, there's historical accounts of what he was being taught on the life, death, and resurrection of Christ from the disciples. So through that disciple to disciple, we can see how the explanation of Christ and the belief of the early disciples of what they had seen carries through. And I didn't mention that. We obviously have their lifestyle, their willingness to suffer, but also we have what their disciples, what their followers said that they taught them. And that's relevant to the historical argument on what the disciples sincerely believed that they had witnessed for themselves. So
Right.
it's almost an additional point to that whole section.
And you talk about in the book, like, the scholars like William Lane Craig and others who are Christian apologists would argue that what's the best explanation that accounts for these four facts? And they argue that, Jesus did rise again. That would be there, although it is a miracle, and you have to grant the assumption or the premise that there is a God. But then taking into account these facts, it increases the probability of a miracle. Now, what would you say, and you address this in the book, to someone who would say, like, and I will talk about some of the naturalistic counter explanations for this, because that's been really interesting for you to
Yeah.
think about. Okay, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, how do we explain these facts? But what if somebody were to say that, look, a man rising from the dead, it's a scientific impossibility, um, and a supernatural explanation is the least likely. And no matter how improbable some of these naturalistic explanations that I want us to talk about are, the burden of proof, like extraordinary claims, require extraordinary evidence. That makes sense. And the burden isn't on us to come up with a compelling naturalistic explanation. Claiming that a man rose from the dead is just impossible. What would you say to that briefly before we dive into the naturalistic theories?
Yeah, so one piece to this is, if God is not real, if God does not exist, then this whole argument is futile. Okay, so that's an admission I'm willing to make, and scholars that use this methodology are willing to make. Now, they're going to use different arguments to propose that God is real. okay, and that he does exist, and the resurrection might be a component of that, but not the final draw, so to speak. So it's the assumption that I am making and others are making on this is that, you know, the resurrection is only plausible if God exists. Now, let me break down a minimal facts argument so people can get some context of what that looks like. You want to create an explanation of a historical event based on all the data that you can glean, all the source material you can gather. Boil it down to these facts, and then how do we explain these facts? What is our hypothesis that we're testing? Okay, so you want something that has great explanatory scope, which means it's covering all the data, the quantity of data. It is best explaining all the quantity of data that is out there and available. And we've covered some of that data just in this discussion. Also, explanatory power. It is a strong, not just is it covering the breadth of material, but it has depth of strength. So it's covering both width and depth for the data that's being offered. Explanatory scope, explanatory power. You want something that is plausible. And some would say, well, a resurrection can't be plausible. But if God exists, it would at least a neutral thing. Okay, if God exists, this is why it's the assumption being drawn in here, is there's nothing implausible about God choosing to do something within his creation should he so choose. So it's plausible because Jesus Christ made here's what maybe make people think, well, is it plausible? Is it not plausible? But Jesus Christ made extraordinary claims about himself, and we have the source material to look at that. People believe Jesus performed miracles during his lifetime. So he claimed and executed heavenly power that was witnessed by many people that were following him. The resurrection provides confirmation of this claim to heavenly authority for Christ. And then while the atheist or agnostic might consider all such claims of the resurrection as implausible, but they have no historical grounds to determine the level of probability or plausibility if God himself does exist. And we see these previous points being proffered that Jesus did amazing things, people saw him do amazing things, he made amazing claims about who he was, and those claims all get verified by the fact that he rose from the dead, making it a plausible account for Christ's resurrection, if that makes sense. That's the argument being proffered. I mean, this is me now really taking down and breaking down all the apologists for Christendom into this core set of data and relaying that.
Mhm.
On the scope and power, he made those claims about himself. People believed he did those things. The tomb's found empty. There's a missing body. Enemies admit the tomb's empty. Disciples believe they saw post-mortem appearances. Paul goes from a skeptic to a fervent believer, randomly seeming out of nowhere. The apostles preached Jesus was alive in the same very city that he had been killed. The New Testament church actually starts, and disciples are willing to be persecuted and die for their eyewitness. These are not disputed facts. Paul's conversion is not disputed, but the resurrection it gives the why.
Mm.
It gives the why in a very effective way. You also want something that is not ad hoc. Now, ad hoc, is contrived. Okay, that it only requires one assumption. Okay, this is not ad hoc if God exists, because God could choose to supernaturally raise Jesus from the dead, and there no contradictions being like pigs fly. Okay, stuff that would be not in line with accepted known fundamental laws, so to speak, or whatever. No contradictions to
I
that.
remember you said in the
The
book.
bodily raising of
Oh, sorry. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt.
go ahead.
I think I remember you said in the book something about like if you say there's 0% chance that there's a God or the divine or the supernatural, no matter how strong a case you could make for the resurrection, the probability, like say, if you made a strong case for that, if you are completely closed and it's 0% chance of the divine, zero times say 80 is still zero. But if you're like,
Still zero.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, if you're like a 1 or 2%, like if you're open to it, then all of a sudden, this case, this argument these facts, this evidence for the resurrection, become stronger if you're open to the possibility of the divine, the supernatural miracles. Then it becomes more of a persuasive case.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this really addresses anything from agnostic on forward in the faith, right? If you're atheist and you say there's no possibility whatsoever, but even if you're agnostic and say, well, I just don't know for sure, but there is a possibility that a greater power exists, this argument is for you. Okay. It applies there and to any increased level of faith. Frankly, from any religion, this should be a convicting consideration for any faith to consider Christendom and the activating miracle of Christ because you have faith in a higher power.
Right. So one point we didn't mention before I we get on these naturalistic theories. Were the disciples anticipating and expecting Jesus to rise again, or when he was crucified, did they just think that's it? Our Messiah has been put to death, and they didn't expect him to rise again. Like, talk about that.
Well, yeah, we when we read the Gospels, we see their reaction, right? Their reaction is despondent. They didn't celebrate and cheer when Jesus is arrested, right? They didn't all high five each other and say, "This is what we've been hearing about for the last 3 years. He's finally arrested. We're going through the atonement. High five!" You know, no, they scatter and run away and hide for fear of their lives. The movement was over. Everything was ending. Everything that happened was counter to this, and false messiahs in the past had been captured and killed, and there was never some meteoric claim that caught fire at all of something powerful happening after that. This was for the disciples, this was the ultimate end and the ultimate defeat, which is ironic because of what turned into the great victory, right? It makes, to your point, everything about this turns on its face, so to speak, in an incredible way.
Okay, so I want to get your thoughts on these counter explanation scenarios. Some of these could be answered very quickly, but the first one is, and I think most average people that you would talk to on the street would just say, like, uh, Jesus didn't die and was buried in a tomb. There was no empty tomb. This is all made up by the disciples. Your quick response to that would be,
Well, every historical piece of evidence says the contrary. So there's not one scrap of historical evidence that's contemporary to the time period of Christ within hundreds of years that would even suggest anything otherwise.
okay, so the second one is, so this is what the early enemies, the opponents of Christianity, were saying. The disciples stole the body. Why not posit that the disciples stole the body?
Well, it would seem like a difficult thing to do when there's armed guard at the tomb, right? So the fact that there's armed guard at the tomb that survive, I mean, the historical record seems to indicate that, there were soldiers at the tomb. And even what if we just said, okay, well, that's in error. That's just not right. Okay, there weren't, could the disciples have stolen the body? Yeah, but these poor people needed to do something with that body. What did they do? What's the evidence for that? Where was I mean, the simple answer is, where was the body? And there's no explanation for what happens to the body. And, it's not like Jerusalem didn't have thousands of armed guards that could conduct a search.
Hmm.
So, you know, it's implausible to consider that the disciples had the method or the means or the ability, skill set, and place and time and property to do anything with the body that would be remotely plausible within the historical record.
I guess adding to that as well, if the disciples did steal the body, let's just posit that, that would be fraud. Like that they would know it's not true, and that would be difficult to explain their sincerity, the persecution, and many of them dying for their testimony of the resurrection. And I don't believe the consensus of most Bible scholars is that they were part of this conspiracy or this fraud. I think most of them view it as sincere, and it's hard. How do you explain that fact if they stole the body? And if there were guards, how did they get past the guards?
No, that's a great point, and I address it just briefly in the book, but you know, there's a whole science to conspiracy theories and breaking them down and apart because it's a compound logarithm of how many people have to be in the know over time, and with increase of time and increased pressure, somebody cracks. Somebody under the point of the knife says, "Oh no, 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 we made it up." So your point is actually extremely valid and would be made by, you know, by any historian, frankly, that if they knew, you're exactly right. Somewhere that breaks down. And I don't want to burst anybody's balloon, but that's like when it comes to like the moon landing. I'm sorry if this like all of a sudden becomes a conspiracy controversy, but like they landed on the moon. The amount of people that it would take to be part of the cover up to say, no, 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 we really shot this in the desert is, just on the people side is so there's actual maths and studies of conspiracy theories over time to show how this just doesn't work. It just doesn't work because somewhere, someone along the line would be like, "Oh yeah, I was there in the desert. I held the camera." Like, yeah, they were full of it, man. And the same is it true for this part of history. People really landed on the moon. That's my whole. If anybody just walks away from this interview and is like, "Wow, we really made it to the moon," I've done my job.
So what if somebody were to argue that, okay, what if they, sincerely believe Jesus rose again, but they just had hallucinations, and lots of people have had hallucinations throughout human history and in religion, so they hallucinated the body of Jesus, and that explains them sincerely going preaching and spreading the gospel and facing persecutions and giving their lives for it. So when you made the comment earlier about people don't give their lives for their beliefs, they might have thought that they saw Jesus, but it was really a hallucination. What do you say to the hallucination hypothesis?
Gary Habermas really does a good job addressing this, and I really respect his work. So if somebody wanted to dive into this, there would be a place to go to look a little further. But the basic long and short of it is 12 people do not hallucinate the same thing. And that's the counterpoint to the hallucination idea. One of the counterpoints is you have to get multiple people believing that they're seeing the exact same thing at the exact same time and place. People do hallucinate, and when they do, they sincerely believe, or somebody that might be schizophrenic, right, or have some mental health issues, they might sincerely believe that they're seeing what they're seeing and be willing to act on it. What you don't see is people with those conditions all in the same room, all seeing the same thing. And I hate to be so dramatic about it, but if you go to a mental health hospital where people are all there with the same condition, they are not all seeing the same thing in the same room. People are not hallucinating the same thing at the same time. Hallucinations don't work like that. So it's not a very plausible, it's not addressing the best and explanatory scope because it's not covering the breadth of the witnesses, and it's not very plausible because it's counter to what we know of how people function that would hallucinate and what we know today from those accounts. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's both like one, the improbability, like you said, of mass hallucination of multiple people all hallucinating the same thing. But even if you granted that could be possible, I guess it doesn't also explain the empty tomb. So
Right.
it's not just they all had a hallucination of Jesus, but how do you explain the empty tomb? And if the disciples stole the body, the hallucination hypothesis doesn't work because they would be frauds. I guess what if somebody posited someone else stole the body, the tomb was empty, and then they hallucinated Jesus? What do you think about that hypothesis? Because that would explain their religious sincerity. They're not frauds, but somebody else happened to steal the body, dealing with the empty tomb.
Well, now that falls into the contrived, right? It under the best explanation of the facts, there's stuff that's just being made up with no explanation or no available data. It's just contrived. Yeah, I can make up that somebody else stole the body and then this to try and account for all these different accounts and Well, what about the empty tomb? Okay, well, that kind of explains that if we have somebody steal it and then everybody else is hallucinating and we're putting all these pieces in, and then they're all so it doesn't line up. It's at the end of the day, you're making stuff up to fill your own preconceived notion of why it shouldn't be. And that is why it wouldn't fall under the best explanation of the facts. And the method to that is actually given out by historical methodology of like Behan McCullough. This isn't me just like making up a method. This is actually a logic of history argument for how people decide what happened in ancient history. This is a path and an approach to try and do that. And if you were trying to do that with any other fact and grabbing things out of the wind like that, it just wouldn't fly. It wouldn't be something that would be taken seriously from a modern historian that was using the same method.
I what about this? This is my final one. This is probably my favorite and probably the most ludicrous one. Jesus died, but he had an identical twin brother who stole the body, and then he himself showed up to the disciples. What do you think of that?
I love it. It's the definition of contrived, right? You're just making up an explanation with no historical backdrop, no evidence for it whatsoever. Nobody mentions the twin ever before. Nobody mentions the twin ever since. You don't think the Jews would have loved to have had an identical twin and then you still have a missing body, you still have an empty tomb to reckon with. It just doesn't line up with anything that was actually proposed. That you know where this comes from.
I can't.
William Lane
I
Craig.
listened to it somewhere, but I can't remember
Yeah,
where.
William Lane Craig was in the middle of a debate with a historian, and he proposed that in the argument, and he eventually completely retracted it and was thoroughly embarrassed that he ever said it because historians that were even non-Christian went after him and said that is just
That's
ludicrous.
absurd.
It's absurd. It's the definition of contrived. You are just making something up to fit your predisposed conclusion that Jesus could not have been raised from the dead. It's not in any way logical to propose that. It's you're the a word we use in my local branch a lot in the church is we say whenever we're just throwing an opinion out there, we're making stuff up, and we call it MSU, like making stuff up university, and that's just making stuff up. That's just MSU.
And have you heard any other counter explanations from serious atheist scholars for accounting for this evidence? Like, do they just like have you heard any others where they try to account for this data?
Well, a great series for someone to look at are the debates that Anthony Flew did against those that believed in the resurrection. And his basic explanation was any explanation is more logical than a miracle because he was coming from the position of it. So, what I see is often today the counterpoint from a Bart or somebody is going to say any naturalistic explanation is more plausible than a theistic explanation because God does not exist. So that's what you see. That's where people go. And when somebody pushes them to get into specifics, they don't have specifics to give if they're an honest, you know,
Mm,
credible, person, and Bart Ehrman certainly is. He's sincerely critical. He sincerely is on the extreme end of agnosticism, and he really doesn't believe that there's any convincing argument that would make him cross over the bridge, so to speak. So, but Anthony Flew is interesting because he died theistic and said at the end of his days that he needed to rewrite all of his books because he was a believer in like David Hume. He was like a philosopher who followed David Hume and was dedicated to that belief. But over time and multiple debates, he eventually, towards the end of his life, completely changed his position and died a theist. Now, whether he fully embraced the resurrection, he never publicly said that. So I have no idea. But he took off that hat. But in his debates and his explanations, again, it was, well, anything would be more plausible than God did it, you know. And eventually he was able to take that hat off and died on the side of theism, which is a remarkable thing for someone of his pedigree.
yeah. And I can understand often where critics or unbelievers or either atheists come from. Like it's hard to believe in the supernatural claims of a man rising again from the dead. Like that is very hard to believe. But whenever I think about the alternative naturalistic explanations to account for these facts, they're also really hard to believe and absurd and kind of contrived, as you said. And if I were an atheist, I would be like, burden proof it in on me to explain this. Like, it's on you as a believer. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I don't need to stoop to the level to explain this, which, like, I understand where they're coming from, but it's also partly a little bit of a dodge because I don't think there is a good naturalistic explanation that accounts for these facts because each of them are highly convoluted or kind of absurd, or they just they don't account for those facts.
Well, even Bart Ehrman, he is willing to admit the conversion of Paul. I mean, he goes so far as to say, yeah, Paul was sincerely converted. He believed, he saw, I mean, Bart makes some serious concessions as a leading atheist he wouldn't call himself atheist. He says agnostic, but he draws the same conclusion. But it's remarkable his willingness to go that far in the approach and even grant Paul in his conversion and his belief system. It's pretty astounding.
Mm. And I guess like if you're completely closed off, if there's no way that there can be a God, there can be a supernatural, that miracles can happen, then in your worldview you would say, well, any naturalistic explanation, no matter how improbable or absurd, is more probable than the supernatural. And I guess that's ultimately a personal decision, and people have to draw their own interpretation. But I think this has been quite a compelling case for the resurrection. And I guess we could both add another one to strengthen the case for the resurrection,
Thank you.
which is the
Thank
Book
you.
of Mormon.
Yeah. And we could add two. We could add the Book of
Oh.
Mormon, and we should. And the second part is experiential. We
Mm.
have a living witness and testimony of Christ being alive in our life and in our hearts. And I've even heard atheists say that that's actually the strongest argument that they could ever hear anyone make because it's personal and it's real and it's tangible for multiple witnesses to give to them. And I've even witnesses watched atheists grant that on the debate stage that it's to them the strongest argument that could be made for the resurrection is Christ being alive in our lives. So,
Yeah. And when you look at
and
the
the Book of
rise of,
Mormon seals the deal. It seals the deal.
yeah, like if the Book of Mormon's true, then that is proof for the resurrection. That is another, as the book says, another testament of Jesus Christ. It's a witness of his resurrection, of his atonement, his appearance to the Nephites after his resurrection as well. And then obviously we'll talk about the witnesses and their experience. Because really, if that's true, this strengthens the case for the resurrection. But you argue in your book that you can apply a lot of these same facts or this same sort of methodological approach. And if you apply it to the Book of Mormon, there is better eyewitness testimony, a lot more contemporary historical sources. We've got more of, well, we have 28% of the original manuscript. We wish we had the originals of the gospel. So really, there's a more compelling case that could be made for the restoration and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I mean, for 100 to 200 years, the leading position was the Gospel of John, and I'm going to draw because we're going to talk about the better sources for a moment. That the Gospel of John maybe was written in the late second century, and then finally a scrap of archaeological evidence comes out of a garbage dump, and all of a sudden this source, the way it was written and what it was written on, is like, oh no, this had to have been earlier. And now John gets pushed closer and closer to the activating event, and now John's starting to be taken seriously because it's clearly maybe even a first century document. Maybe it even came from John, right? But what we don't have, while there's this incredible manuscript tradition for the New Testament where there's like parts and pieces of manuscripts spread all over Europe, Middle East, and Africa. By funneling down that like a family tree, you can get close to the original sources and what did Mark actually say, what did Luke actually say, and try and get close to the activating event. What we don't have is the very first handwritten Gospel of Mark. We don't have that. Okay. We don't have any of the original letters of Paul. What we have are transcriptions from transcriptions from transcription, copies of copies of copies. That's what we have for the New Testament. Now, there's a lot of reasons why those really do trace very close to the originals in a lot of ways, and that's a whole discipline to look at. The amazing thing with the Book of Mormon is we have the source manuscript. 28% still exists today. And how much did your church pay for it? I forget.
Millions?
It was bought for, like $30 million at some point in time. I mean, the entire printer's manuscript, so the very first copy exists today. Now, just to put on our hats for a moment to be equal on all sides, imagine there was a document in the New Testament tradition where all 12 apostles took their signature and said, I saw Jesus alive for myself, and gave a statement between them all. And then they all signed it. And then we didn't have the original. No, the original, that got destroyed. But we have the very first copy of that. I'm telling you, that would be the most important artifact historically for all of Christendom. It would be, without a doubt, would be considered the most important artifact that has ever been discovered or ever found or ever used to argue for the resurrection and the Christian movement. We have that for the Book of Mormon. We have the first copy of the 3 witness and 8 witness statements that are on the printer's manuscript. We have the original document where their signatures would have been put, but we don't have the part that exists today where it was given. Okay, only 28% of the original man. Sadly, a lot of it was sold off by Emma's second husband, and they raised a little bit of money by selling some of the pages off, and also it was put into the Nauvoo house, and unfortunately, water damaged a significant portion of the document itself. But I don't think anybody would question that the first copy that we have is a direct representation from the original. So we have the witnesses, the source material from decades and decades of some of their lives. Some of them died within 5 years, but decades and decades of testimonies and witnesses, over like 250 source materials that directly come back in either firsthand or secondhand account to the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. The power of the early eyewitnesses to claim that they saw the golden plates and claim that it was a true and accurate translation is beyond compare. I'll give a couple of examples here. The 3 witnesses are not really 3 witnesses, they're 4. Joseph is there. They see the golden plates in 2 groups of 2. One group of 3. So you have David and Oliver and Joseph together in the grove, and then you have Martin and Joseph together. So you have actually multiple independent attestation of those different early experiences, both showing the golden plates. Martin sees it, my eyes, 'tis enough, my eyes have beheld, my eyes have beheld. And the voice of the angel is very important, because a voice from heaven, comes down and declares that the translation is correct. So with the 3 witnesses, you don't just have an eyewitness of the golden plates, which, by the way, I got them. They're right there.
Oh, there they are. Oh,
there they are. So mystery
you
solved.
find them.
Okay.
The angel gave them to you to look after.
It's just amazing. For $200, it's amazing what you can buy.
Wow.
So, but you have a group of 3 and a group of 2 independently attesting. The voice comes down and says the translation is correct. So you're actually, the 3 witnesses are critically important, because there's a connection being made in that vision from the golden plates to the actual translation of the text. And that's how you build the bridge through independent. The 8 witnesses are critically important for the tangibility of the golden plates themselves, because they, along with Joseph, so there's a group of 9, see the plates. Actually, according to John Whitmer, it was 2 groups of 4. So he had them and maybe passed them within these 2 groups of 4. And they flip the leaves of the plates. They hold them. It's very tangible. It's very, very interactive. So I think I record
Uh,
a lot of the statements that are powerful, but I love
yeah.
John Whitmer. John Whitmer's like, I held these for myself. I examined them. I turned the leaves, enough to satisfy all of us. We all looked at them. So the tangibility of the artifact is something the three witnesses did not have, but they had a more heavenly, more Paul-like experience that was critically important. And there's a critical tie to that, to the actual translation and the text. And then the eight witnesses are the tangible, turn the pages, and both are amazing, intricate, and super important. When you put them together and you consider the 60 plus statements that are available from the eight witnesses, the over 200 statements from the three witnesses, there's nothing like that in Christianity for the resurrection. And ultimately, I believe in the resurrection, but there's nothing like that offered to me on the other side of the fence. This is so much more potent, powerful, and direct. Part of that's because it's the 19th century, right? There's more writings, more things are being held, but thank God for it. And so we can examine that under the same critical lens to do the same type of evaluation. And there's way more material to consider. When we talk about explanatory scope and power, there's a lot more data to look at when it comes to the witnesses for the golden plates and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon.
And you get outsider atheists like Alex O'Connor, who recently was on Jubilee, and him and Jacob had the debate. But he even said, he was like, "Hey, you Christians, there's better evidence historically for the witnesses of the gold plates compared to the resurrection. And if you just look at it from a historical point of view, that is the case." Now, I think I want to stop here for part one. Oh, one last
Yeah,
thought.
can I make one last comment
Yes.
based on Alex's comments that he made online?
Yes.
About halfway through the book, I paused for a month and a half, and the thought that was flooding through my mind was, if this got in the hands, if an atheist would take this book seriously, they could use it against the people that believed in the resurrection, because the argument was so strong for the Book of Mormon that it would be taken and used and pushed back. And I also thought it's a great compliment to my book if they ever do, but I thought that there was a first, I never thought the book would get that far, okay, that would ever be taken seriously. But when Alex said what he said, something that actually paused me about halfway through the book came true, okay? Because it's not that he's read my book, but some of the arguments I made in my book were presented to him. And it has pushed the narrative far enough that even somebody like Alex, who is, a non-believer but open to, I love the way he thinks. I love his podcast. I love listening to him. I
Yep.
find him sincere, right, in his position. But he heard the arguments I made in my book, and he recognized that it was stronger than the case for the resurrection, and he started to push that narrative. And all I can say is that's awesome, and I take it as one of the greatest compliments that's ever happened to me since the book came out.
That's so cool. And yeah, I think if you're being objective and intellectually honest, our mutual friend Stephen Pinecker, who is a Christian, not a Latter-day Saint or a believer in the Book of Mormon, would also acknowledge that historically there is stronger evidence to support the Book of Mormon. Now, I think this would be a good place to end for part one, because I also want us to dive in to the case and the evidence and the facts surrounding coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the witnesses of the gold plates as well. And I think will be a lot for people to chew on for part one. But I think this has been a great episode discussing the case for the resurrection, because often we don't talk about it much in apologetics. And I just recommend people to go buy this book, Witnessing Miracles, the historical evidence for the resurrection, and the Book of Mormon. It's a great book. I think it's an important one. It's a game changer. I think people, both if you're a member of the church or if you're a believer in the restoration, the Book of Mormon, need to read the book. Christians definitely need to read the book, and atheists should. And if it doesn't convince you in God or the resurrection, at least you can use it against Christians who have a double standard against Mormonism. But make sure you come back for part two, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.